How do you do, folks? Welcome back to my series on selecting the correct AR parts for your build. So far we've inserted the bolt catch, the magazine release, buffer tube, and the buffer. Today we're going to cover a topic that deserves its very own section. It's possibly one of the items you could build your whole rifle around, the trigger. I'm assuming you've been to the movies, so you know the trigger's going to protrude down here, and then we're going to use these two holes and some retaining pins to hold all the components into place. Let's assume for the sake of convenience that you've gone with the low-cost option of a mil-spec trigger. So let's get this lower out of here, and we'll discuss the parts of the mil-spec trigger. First off, for the two holes I showed you, we're going to have two identical retaining pins. We have the hammer spring, the trigger spring, the disconnector, and the disconnector spring. And like a lot of things in life, it's important to identify your parts so you don't commit a faux pas. Right, guys? And I will be including a link in the description to a video where someone installs this stuff. Much like the last video, if I try and do it under the camera, it's going to be inelegant, and likely I'll be chasing springs around the room, saying things I might regret later, and embarrassing myself. So we'll get this out of the way. And for this operation, I'll use my block and my trusty punch set. While I get that thrown together, let's go to Koko Head and watch my coworker take a few shots with his AR. You know, if I'm being honest, that all went surprisingly well. The trigger went in without too much fighting, and I did have to use a little bit of elbow grease on the hammer because of the way the springs lay. With the help of a very shiny 9/64 brass punch and the hammer and the nylon end, I was able to persuade those pins into place. Let's have a peek at the orientation at the top. You can see the hammer spring there. There's the hammer. When we pull the trigger, you can see the disconnector there. The spring is underneath it, and then the trigger spring rests on the bottom. And we know we did it correctly. You don't want to drop a hammer on a lower by itself or it's going to mar up your finish, but so we'll hold that in place, but pull the trigger and it comes up. I'm holding the trigger back right now. If we push the hammer back down and release the trigger, it should just pop. There it is. Alright, well that went a lot better than expected. That's the mil-spec version. We're going to take a few moments and scroll through some internet photos and look at some of the more expensive options you can go with, particularly the drop-in triggers, and we'll take a few minutes to talk about trigger pull as well and why you might want a lighter or heavier trigger pull. So we already got a look at the mil-spec trigger, and the consideration for that, of course, was inexpensive. But let's spend a few more dollars and see what we can get for our money. This is an example of a $240 trigger.
It's quite popular, and the premise is that all the contacting parts have been smoothed out. You're going to get a nicer, more consistent trigger pull. It's not going to be gritty. It may be lighter, and you're going to get a better shot off because you can predict when the trigger is going to break. You can take the trigger weight even further and have an adjustable trigger such as this one, and you can select your weight down to, in some cases, 2 pounds and on up to 8, 9 or more. And that lets you have a very light trigger break if you're doing target shooting, or a much higher trigger break if you're using it for a self-defense weapon and want to make sure that you don't discharge it accidentally under stress. Another option is a drop-in trigger. And what you're looking at here is all the components of the trigger that's already pre-mounted into what they call a cassette. And the advantage of this is that all the factory specs can be done in the manufacturing process of the trigger and are not subject to slop and variation on different manufacturers that make the lower receivers. So you're, in theory, supposed to get a more consistent, less gritty trigger pull.
We've talked about mil-spec, premium, and drop-in triggers. One of the other things we should discuss is the trigger's action itself, and in this case that would be single stage or two-stage triggers. An example of single stage trigger would be this Rise armament that we saw the picture of earlier, and that's installed in my AR here. And the way that functions is you just apply pressure, and when you reach the breaking point, it snaps. Some folks, particularly target shooters, are interested in a two-stage trigger. So how does a two-stage trigger work? The premise is that you divide the weight into two portions. One is the take-up, where you would draw back on the trigger, and the second is the break, where the final weight will set the trigger off. And that makes the trigger feel as if it's lighter. Now, I do not have any AR triggers in two-stage, but if you'll bear with me. I do, however, have this guy. Why did the Bulgarians decide that an AK needed a two-stage trigger? I have no idea. With this, there's the take-up and the break. Well, I think we've done a bang-up job of discussing triggers.
Single stage, two-stage, mil-spec, premium, and drop-in.
So with that information, I'm going to send you on your way. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next week.